Rini quoted historian L.L. White. Instead of being aided by instinctive responses to external stimuli and by mimicry of the forms of a stable social tradition, the individual was now increasingly dominated and controlled at moments of decision by the special forms of his own thought processes. The individual became aware of his own thought.
Rini suggested that we have evolved to perceive time the way we do as a flow of events because of the demands of biological survival. If we were not intensely aware of the narrow time slice we call now, we could not deal with emergencies in an effective, life-preserving way. The physicist John Wheeler said, "Time is what keeps everything from happening at once." We have often been given the advice that we should be more conscious of the here and now, rather than occupying our minds with remembering and planning. It was interesting, therefore, to read in Rini's book about the brain-injured man who lived his life in an eternal present. He has lost his sense of past time completely. Every moment believes he has just woken up from a period of unconsciousness. His wife described his world as consisting of just a moment, with no past to anchor it and no future to look forward to.
Well, that is a kind of timelessness, but it sounds more like hell to me than a state of eternal bliss. We're now going to have a period of silence introduced by verses of William Blake's poetry, followed by a musical interlude. And after that, we'll try to imagine what we think a timeless, blissful state would be like. Now, the first poem is from Blake's Auguries of Innocence, and I think you've probably all heard this many times. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour.
Now, a second poem also by William Blake. He who binds himself to a joy does the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise.
In the first part of our address, we were focusing on the time aspect of eternity. Eternity isn't the same thing as time going on in an endless further. Eternity is somehow beyond time. But time involves change, so does eternity mean a changeless state? It's hard to imagine how that could be a state of bliss. Now, I can think of blissful moments in my life and blissful events, and one that comes readily to mind happened during Christmas Day 2006. We were at Lake Louise in Canada. We went for a walk after our Christmas lunch through the forest beside the frozen lake during a snowfall. There was no wind, so even though it was about -10, we were not cold. Everything was enveloped in a soft, pristine, gentle whiteness. It was so beautiful and peaceful, I couldn't imagine anything more blissful. And I told Clive I thought I was in my heaven. But even if it was possible to be in such surroundings all the time, I would not want to live in them permanently. No matter how good something is, it would cease to be good if it never changed.
If you were conscious of living in a state of changelessness, it would be boring. I don't think there is eternal life after death. There is a fundamental problem that the earth will not last forever. What would be the conscious if our consciousness outlasted the earth? We also know now the universe won't last forever. Would anyone want to be conscious of either a big crunch or the heat death of the universe? On the other hand, we're told that the universe has no boundary or limit. If there's no limit, to the dimension of distance beyond Earth, then how can there be a limit to the passage of time?
It's as hard to imagine endlessness as it is to imagine timelessness. Perhaps this is because we're limited by the physiology of our brains. One thing we can be sure of is that our brains won't last forever and cannot exist in a timeless or changeless state.
We know the atoms and molecules in our bodies all get recycled. In some sense they are eternal. Some of them will eventually become part of another form of life, maybe human, but maybe not. I think eternity is more to do with the fact that once an event has occurred, it can never be undone. The fact it happened will always be true. That truth lasts an eternity. Having been introduced to Unitarian philosophy, I feel that many people are trapped in a medieval view of their place in creation.
But people are comforted by the historical concept of eternal life. They're comforted by the concept of being reunited after death with lost loved ones or being restored to health, for example, and they probably don't feel trapped. They're imagining a continuation of their individual consciousness with their memories and their future intact. Rini wrote that purposeful human life is impossible if the future is denied, because purpose by its very nature is future-oriented. He said that this problem did not exist for archaic humans because, like the animals from which they sprang, they were unaware of time. He wrote, quote, "As humanity struggled towards self-consciousness, a temporal sense was born. But during the dreaming ages and far into historical time, man's natural resonance with the cyclic patterns of nature, embodied in the ingrained belief in reincarnation or resurrection, tranquilized and quietened his fear of death."
Rini has pointed out that only in the last century or so the Western science has, for many in our society, stripped the last protective veils of faith from our eyes. At the precise moment we become fully aware of our own mortality, we are forced to confront the mortality of the cosmos itself, and with it a hitherto unthinkable concept, the end of time, the death of forever, not in the little sense of the end of me, but in the total sense of the end of all. According to Rini, we have in our time arrived in the forbidden land. What lies before us is the final frontier, the mysterious border, at which we are prevented from seeing more deeply into the nature of things, not by the construction of the world, but by the construction of ourselves.
Rini believed that the state of self-consciousness is a phase that we must pass through to reach a higher state of consciousness. We greatly fear events that will change our sense of identity or damage our ego selves. He believed that it's only by experiencing such psychological deaths that we can lose our fear of physical death. In his book, Rini quotes Einstein. "A human being experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. And this delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our own personal desires and to affections for a few persons nearest to us." Rini thought the chaotic state of Western society is a direct result of the proliferation of these personal ego-self boundaries. Now, The Death of Forever was published in 1991, and our world is even more chaotic almost 2 decades later.
Rini wrote that the fear of physical death can prepare a receptive mind for possible transformation, but it is a transformation that few undergo. They would have to choose between the death of the self, which means liberation of consciousness from time, and the continuation of the self, which means entombment of consciousness in time.
Now, at this stage, I'm having a struggle to grasp Rini's ideas. We all know it isn't ethical to behave selfishly, that is, to act without any consideration of the well-being of others. But having no concern at all for oneself and one's own well-being would mean, I think, one wouldn't be capable of helping anyone or anything, because one would have very poor health and no skills and no resources. And I can't grasp the concept of having consciousness without a sense of who is being conscious.